2023 was the 30th anniversary of the promotion, and they delivered on why they are the top dogs in MMA, with classic fights that will go down in the books for years to come. New records and some legends retiring, 2023 is definitely a year to remember. Some notable fights, we'll break these down into 3 and 5 round categories, and we'll start off with 5-round fights. Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira 2 at UFC 287, with the rivalry between the former kickboxers where Adesanya had lost twice to Poatan after losing a decision and getting knocked out. The two met at UFC 281 for the middleweight title, where Stylebender lost via 5th round TKO after having his leg battered in a back-and-forth battle for 4 rounds and eventually meeting the wrath of Poatan's devastating left hand. He seemed to be cursed when fighting the Brazilian. But on the rematch for the title at UFC 287, after seeming to have no answer for the calf kick in the first round, Adesanya would go into the second round with a plan and knew he had to knock out Alex Pereira in order to get the victory. With his back against the wall and everything on the line, Adesanya would play possum and end up knocking out the Brazilian with a devastating right hand and have one of the coldest post-fight celebrations.
I hope every one of you behind your screens on this arena can feel this level of happiness just one time in your life.
Islam Makhachev versus Alexander Volkanovski won at UFC 284. After Volkanovski had dominated the featherweight division and was rated as a pound-for-pound best fighter in the world, he set his sights on being the 5th fighter to join the double champ fraternity alongside the likes of Conor McGregor, Daniel Cormier, Henry Cejudo, and Amanda Nunes. The two would face off in Perth, Australia at UFC 284 and put on one of the best lightweight title fights the world had ever seen, with the two battling back-to-back round for round where Makhachev won a decision that came with a bit of controversy. A lot of people thought the Australian had done enough to win, but the Dagestani had walked away with the title. They met again at UFC 294 where Volk was knocked out with a head kick in the first round at UFC 294 later in the year. Max Holloway versus Arnold Allen at UFC Fight Night. When you think of the word barn burner, that's exactly what this was. With the former featherweight champ winning the bout and winning 4 of 5 rounds on 2 of the 3 judges' scorecard, but this bout was close in many of the rounds. The second round was the closest, where one judge gave the round to Allen. Allen also took the 5th round, and the fight ended in impressive fashion as both fighters slugged it out in the middle of the octagon, where Holloway ended the fight with a knockdown over the English fighter. If you got Fight Pass, or if it's online somewhere, you should definitely check this one out. It truly shows you that Max Holloway is the only #1 contender. He's kind of stuck there. With many more 5-rounders worth your attention, I could go on forever. Fights like UFC 283, Glover Teixeira versus Jamal Hill, Ilia Topuria versus Josh Emmett at UFC on ABC, the return of the GOAT, John Jones versus Cyril Gane at UFC 285, Poirier versus Gaethje 2 at UFC 291, Nunes versus Aldana where the Lioness retired. There's so many more to name, but I'm just not going to go and name them all. I only named 3 3-round fights because there's easily over 50 that should be on the must-see list in 2023. But my top 3 are Justin Gaethje versus Rafael Fiziev at UFC 286. This back-and-forth battle was a banger of a fight, with the two fighters going back and forth, battering each other. Justin Gaethje would get the nod from the judges after putting pause on Fiziev for 3 rounds in the co-main event. He also used some of his wrestling and got a takedown late in the bout. Jalen Turner versus Dan Hooker at UFC 290 was one for the books. The two went head-to-head in an impressive 3-round fight where Dan Hooker would win a decision after getting his arm broke early in the fight. But the Australian showed true grit against the well-rounded fighter. Jalen Turner was no slouch in the fight, winning a round and putting Hooker in some trouble early in the bout, but ultimately would lose a split decision against the Aussie.
By split decision, Dan the Hangman Hooker.
With a late appearance in the year, we have to add Irene Aldana versus Carol Rosa at UFC 296, where the two ladies went to war. In a fight of the night performance, the back-and-forth battle resulted in a record-setting amount of leg kicks landed by Rosa after landing 95 leg kicks, with the previous record being 76. She smashed that record. But that's not the only record that was broken. The two women also set a single-fight women's bantamweight record for 349 significant strikes. Aldana got the nod, but Rosa showed grit and grew her fan base immensely after the bout. There were also a few title changes in 2023 as well. John Jones claimed the vacant heavyweight title after Francis Ngannou left the UFC against Cyril Gane at UFC 285. Alex Pereira kickboxed his way into light heavyweight gold after TKOing Yuri Prochazka in the second round of their championship bout at UFC 295. The middleweight championship changed hands twice. Once when Israel Adesanya knocked out Poatan at UFC 287, then again when Sean Strickland won a unanimous decision in dominating fashion against Adesanya at UFC 293. Sean O'Malley knocked out Aljamain Sterling at UFC 292. Brandon Moreno defeated Davison Figueiredo to claim flyweight gold at UFC 283, then lost the title to Alexandra Pantoja at UFC 290 just 6 months later. Valentina Shevchenko also lost her title after getting subbed by Alexa Grasso in the 4th round of their fight at UFC 285. Along with the records and the excitement, we saw some of our favorites drop the gloves in the octagon and call it a career. We'll start off with Mauricio Shogun Rua. After suffering a knockout loss to Ihor Potieria at UFC 283, Shogun decided it was time to drop the gloves after a lengthy and legendary MMA career with fights in Pride, where he was the champ before joining the UFC. He would join the UFC and fight Lyoto Machida shortly after for the light heavyweight strap and lose a unanimous decision, but in the rematch, he had it out to finish Lyoto in the first round by knockout at UFC 113. He then lost the belt to the GOAT and never seemed to firmly place his feet back down in the light heavyweight division. After a legendary career, we say thanks to Mauricio Shogun Rua. The Korean Zombie retired after a long, fulfilling career in the UFC, Chan Sung Jung. He knew Americans had an affinity for zombies and adopted the nickname in order to gain popularity with the American crowd, with some of the most entertaining fights in the featherweight division. On his way out the door, he suffered a knockout loss to Max Holloway at UFC Fight Night Holloway vs. the Korean Zombie. With wins over Dustin Poirier, Dan Ige, and Frankie Edgar, the Zombie would fall short against Alexander Volkanovski and cited shortly after the fight that he was going to retire. He set out to be champ and realized it wasn't possible to obtain this goal anymore, so he wanted to leave the sport on his own terms. With great submissions and awesome performances, I couldn't imagine a featherweight division without Zombie, but that's sadly a reality now. Amanda Nunes, the GOAT of female mixed martial arts. After holding down both the women's bantamweight and featherweight divisions since 2018, she had some of the most exciting knockouts and fights in the bantamweight and featherweight divisions ever, knocking out Chris Cyborg, knocking out Ronda Rousey, knocking out Holly Holm and Raquel Pennington. She would go on to be submitted by Juliana Pena in the second round at UFC 269. She would then bounce back and batter Pena for 5 rounds in the rematch. After defending the title against Aldana at UFC 289 and putting on a clinic, she retired as the double champ forever. Jorge Gamebred Masvidal. After a long fight career, both in the streets with Kimbo Slice and in MMA, Masvidal put on some of the best shows in UFC's 30-year history, with his most notable 5-second knockout where he set the record against Ben Askren at UFC 239. With a crazy flying knee. He would go on to batter Nate Diaz and win by doctor stoppage going into the 4th round of their bout. He would lose twice to Kamaru Usman, and the second fight ended with a knockout that would send him in a skid into retirement. With impressive knockouts over Donald Cerrone and Darren Till, Gamebred was a gangster and wasn't afraid to handle business outside the octagon as well. Glover Teixeira. He was another OG that called it a day after a dominating defeat against former light heavyweight champion Jamal Hill for the vacant light heavyweight title at UFC 283. With wins over Rashad Evans, Jared Cannonier, Anthony Smith, and Thiago Santos, the former champion won the belt in 2022 against Jan Blachowicz and claimed UFC gold at the age of 40. After losing the belt in 2022 in a back-and-forth brawl with Yuri Prochazka, he checked every block and attained the goals he set forth in his fighting career. After a successful and long fighting career, the Brazilian champ has now set his sights on coaching, and his star pupil is Alex Pereira. There are more that retired this year, and we bid thanks to all of them. Wrapping up this year with so much excitement, it's hard not to be excited for what 2024 might have to offer.